Amen. We are in Daniel chapter 3 tonight, and what you can do when we end this evening, what we'll do is we'll kind of follow the Wednesday evening devotional schedule since we no longer have classes in the back at this current time, since everything is here in the auditorium. So we'll kind of get better at this until we go back to classes. But this will give us a more structured environment to have our class and to have all the other things that we regularly have here in the auditorium on Wednesday nights. So we will continue to do this and get better at it as we go along. But we are in Daniel chapter 3 this evening, and I want to explain why we're in Daniel 3. For some of you, we have been doing the book of Daniel for the last few weeks online. We've introduced the book. We spent a night introducing the book, and we have spent a night on chapter 1 and a night on chapter 2. And then we've looked at some other things inside the book of Daniel and about the life of Daniel as well. So we pick up in Daniel chapter 3 this evening. But I want us to get a quick overview of Daniel chapter 1 and Daniel chapter 2 as we think about this evening. I want you to remember in Daniel chapter 1, we're introduced to Daniel. We're introduced to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We are introduced into a variety of individuals that serve in the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar there in Babylon. And we see God's people who have been taken captive. And this group has taken a select of those that were knowledgeable in certain areas in the sciences and other areas, and they have assumed them into the kingdom of Babylon to serve in a governmental style role as princes and governors and other things throughout the country. Now, what you have in Daniel chapter 1 is you have the pinnacle of the chapter that comes in verse 8, because in verse 8 of Daniel 1, you read that Daniel purposed in his heart. And you read the rest of the passage and you will find that he would not defile himself before God. So Daniel chapter 1, we're kind of just introduced, and we see the principal factor behind the individual that's called Daniel. And he did not want to damage himself before God and ruin his reputation before God. Thus he faced all of those individuals and had his own people to stand with him in chapter 1. Chapter 2 is a very interesting chapter because Daniel is asked to interpret a dream. He's a part of this governmental court, and Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. He wants to know what it means, and he wants to know what the dream is. And he says, I will kill all of my wise men and scholars and advisors, which Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were a part of. And God gives this vision to Daniel. Daniel brings it to the king, tells him the interpretation. And in verse 47, the pinnacle of that chapter, the king answered unto Daniel and said, of a truth it is that your God is a God of God and a Lord of lords. He even calls him there a revealer of secrets. So you have the king of the most powerful group of people in this entire known world, as we're reading about it in the end of Daniel chapter 2, giving God the praise. But as you roll into Daniel chapter 3, which is where we're at tonight, remember we're doing this course one chapter a night, and we're studying it not in chapter order, but in order of chronological events. So as the events took place inside of this book is written out of order. So you go Daniel chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then things start to change up on us, and we will follow that chapter outline in succession. But chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4 all follow each other in the event. So here's what's happened. Chapter 1, we get the introduction to Daniel and those other three men. Chapter 2, we see this great dream, and the king, he pronounces that God is a God of gods. So the most powerful man in the world, who is he looking to and who is he praising in chapter 2? It's the God of heaven. Thus, we roll ourselves into chapter 3 this evening. And you probably know chapter 3 as a chapter that you've studied maybe as a child. You talk about that fiery furnace. But we're calling this chapter a hot situation because you have a group of individuals who could have went along with everybody else, could have done what everybody else was doing, could have said what everybody else was saying, yet they follow after the God of heaven. And we're going to see these individuals play out. And what I want you to do is see four different things. Now, just for your information, every week we will have a handout to help us go through this study because we have a lot of information to cover in one night. So chapter 3's handout is right here. Chapter 4 for next week is right here. And then next week, I will give you chapter 5 handouts as well, and you'll be able to pick those up 1 week in advance as we make our way toward Wednesday evenings. We will also, for some of you who would like to have these this way, we will get them on our website so you can download them on your tablets or phones, however you'd like to do that. But do remember that these will be here for you every Wednesday evening, and we'll take them away after Wednesday. Of course, we'll put them back next Wednesday evening for when you come in. So this will just help us go through our study and for you to be able to be prepared for what we're going to look at next week. So here's what we're going to do. 4 different things I want us to see, and we'll comment about the entire chapter as we go through. Number 1, let's notice the view of a king. And we're going to see this in verse 1, 2, and 3. And we're going to see Nebuchadnezzar, who, remember, had this dream. God is the one who revealed that dream to him because he could not remember and it troubled him. God told him what that dream was going to be. And you even remember in Daniel chapter 2, verse 44, the kingdom that was never to be destroyed was talked about there in chapter. So we're going to see, number 1, the view from Nebuchadnezzar. What is Nebuchadnezzar seeing? Then number 2, we're going to notice the view of a nation. And we're going to see some of the governors and the princes and the other people who are working around the king and see what they see. And then as we roll into the last 2 parts, we're going to look at the view of a rebel. There's going to be some individuals who, well, they don't do what everybody else is doing. And matter of fact, there are going to be some people, and you know this, you've studied it before, who are going to say, they're not doing it. Probably the saddest commentary on Daniel chapter 3 is these group of people who stand up and say, you know, he's not doing it. Reminds me of a lot of things that happen in our time. And then we'll end this evening by looking at the view of a servant. We will see these individuals who are servants, and we will see individuals who show a king who the true God is as we see those 4 people in that fiery furnace as we end. So let's start off with the view of the king, and this picks us up in Daniel chapter 1. And what we do is we see his dream. It's number 1, verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king, who made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and the breadth was 60 cubits. And he sat in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Remember this dream that he had in chapter 2. Daniel had to tell him about the dream. Daniel had to interpret the dream. Now, what did that dream mean for Nebuchadnezzar? Think about it in the long term. What did that dream mean? Whose kingdom was going to be destroyed? It was Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, wasn't it? So you have him almost forgetting, it seems, what this great statue was going to mean, because really it meant eventually his kingdom was coming to an end. Now, you know in Daniel 2:44, this kingdom that shall never be destroyed is the church. So all of these kingdoms of men are going to be destroyed, and Nebuchadnezzar knew what that meant, but in chapter 3, as the time passed from chapter 2 to chapter 3, he builds this image, and he really builds his dream as we see him following through that. And you remember those 5 different areas that took place, including the church being part of that dream as well, as you look at Daniel 2, 22 or 29 through verse 35. So you have his dream in this view of the king. And then inside of the second part of our lesson tonight, you have a king who has a dedication. This is verse 3. Nebuchadnezzar, or verse 2, he brings all these people together, and read what he does. He brings the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers to this place. Why? Because he's going to have this great dedication. Now, think about this for just a minute. What is he dedicating? What is he dedicating? He's really dedicating his demise, isn't he? What does the statue mean? Well, eventually Babylon is going to fall. And here he is setting this great statue up to really look at all of these things in this concept. So you have Nebuchadnezzar who's building this big statue. He's following after this dream. And you have verse 3. He makes this dedication. He has this event, Daniel 3:3. The princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, all these people, they're there. Now, what would you do if you were there? King tells you here in just a minute. He's already set this image up. You see in the end of verse 3, Nebuchadnezzar had set up. It's there. By the way, you wouldn't miss it when you got there. He's building this great statue to promote himself, but he knows his demise is going to come. And thus you see the view of the king because he has this command. We're not going to read verses 4 through 6, but you can look at them there. They're in your handout. They're in your Bible. They're on the screen. What does the king tell everyone to do? Well, he sends a herald, verse 4, and he gives this information. After all of these instruments play, what are they supposed to do? Bow down and worship this image of who? Who's this image of? It's Nebuchadnezzar. You bow down and worship me. Now, what do we know about Nebuchadnezzar? His kingdom is going to, chapter 2, eventually cease. So Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 1, who is introduced to God. Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2, who begins to believe in God, seems to forget about God as we open up chapter 3 and see this view of a king. So he gives this command, and whoever doesn't do this, verse 6, is going to be thrown into a midst of a burning, fiery furnace. By the way, we'll see more about that as we go through.
Did they have somebody pushing him like they did in the book of Esther, or was that a bit on the
There are a lot of different historical documents that talk about how the king would have been transported. You would have seen Nebuchadnezzar as royalty of royalty. I would suggest to you that he never entered a room. He never entered an event. He never entered anything without being the highest person, as in the grandest entrance inside. So I would suggest to you that Nebuchadnezzar always came into a room with some type of presence so that everyone knew he was there. He was full of himself. As a matter of fact, chapter 4 is the chapter that brings Nebuchadnezzar down. What happens to Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4? What does he eat? The grass. So he contends with the other wild animals as he's being humbled. As a matter of fact, the end of chapter 4, probably the most interesting end of a chapter in the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar recognizes that those who exalt themselves above God will be abased. That's what the end of the chapter says. That's right. Can you imagine how much labor it would take to make such a statue? By the way, without modern machinery. We don't think about that very often. But here he is. He's made this command. And it's time to see all of these things take place. And it's his moment. So verse 7 becomes, and all of this starts taking place. And they're told, when this happens, here's what you're going to do. And it was time, because the king has set up his statue, and the moment was here. And so what we have in the first part of Daniel chapter 3 is the view of a king. And as we've already noted, and I'll quote Willard on this, he was full of himself. That's who we're looking at. So that moves us into phase number 2. And let's see the view of a nation. Let's see some people. And by the way, it's interesting when you start talking about people, and I've said this before, I still believe in this statement, though the times have changed, people really have not changed. The world is still involved in sin, isn't it? Is that true? Okay, that's still true. The world is still following after what it wants to do, as it used to do in the times of old. Is that not true? That's right. And by the way, this was the popular moment. When that music played, they are to worship the statue, which is Nebuchadnezzar. But what about God? So put yourself in the shoes, verse 7, of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are there at this particular event. By the way, you'll remember as Daniel interpreted this great dream in chapter 2, or the great dream in chapter 2, that Daniel asked for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to have a better place in the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. You remember that? If you'll see that in the last part of chapter 2. It's specifically in verse 49. So here they are. Everybody else is going to worship this statue. Let's see what happens. Well, you see the cry of the people of this nation, specifically these princes and these other people who were just like or in similar positions to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You can read all of those titles in verse 3 again. But they gave this cry beginning out inside of verse 8. Therefore, at the time when the people heard, as you see in verse 7, they heard the noise, And then inside of verse 8, you read this, "Wherefore at that time certain Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews." Well, who's that specifically going to be in just a minute? Who are the three that are going to the fiery furnace? Well, it's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we'll see them in just a moment. So they have this cry. They go to the king. They say, "Nebuchadnezzar," and you look in this, and I write at verse 8 and 9, or verse 9 and 10, "O king, live forever." How many times in the book of Daniel do you read the phrase, "O king, live forever"? That's a build-up phrase, isn't it? So they build up the king. Didn't you say that whoever does not worship this image, why, they're going to fall in the midst of a burning fiery furnace, as it ends verse 11? What's happening in verse 8 through 11 is some individuals, we don't know how many, but we know at a time certain of them came near the king and said, "They're not doing it." Did your children ever do that? One of you saying no, and I don't believe you. Did you ever do that? Okay, now listen, let me ask you a question. I don't want to create a conversation on this, but I just want to say it. Do politicians ever do that? Does our world ever do that? Look at them. That happens, doesn't it? That's what's taking place here in verses 8 through 11. Look, they're not more worried about the others than themselves, and thus you have the cry of the nation. You have a tattling nation, and thus you rolled into their action. This is the action that took place. There are certain Jews. What an interesting way. There are certain whom thou hast set over the affairs of the princes of Babylon, or the provinces of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king. What's interesting is, this is to me, they knew their names. They knew their names. It's these men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They don't regard you. They don't respect you. They don't love you like we do. They don't serve thy gods, which, by the way, who was the greatest god of Babylon? You already know his name. Who was the greatest god of Babylon? Starts with an N. Ends with Nebuchadnezzar. Who was this about? This was not about some god. This was about a king. They don't worship you. They don't serve our gods. They don't worship the golden image which you have set up. That's interesting to me. They were more concerned about tattling on the fellow individuals of their nation than they were anything else. And thus leads us to the problem, and this is many times the problems that Christians find themselves in. This is verse 13. That is not verse 13 in the handout or inside of the PowerPoint. I apologize for that, but look at verse 13 in your Bible. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage, what problem takes place? Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage, that's verse 14. As a matter of fact, you can go back to verse 13 and notice the problem. Who didn't bow down? Well, it was these three. And that led them to a problem, didn't it? That led them to an issue inside of their own lives. Is it always popular to do the right thing? Well, there is the theme of chapter 3 of the book of Daniel. It's not always popular to do the right thing. Now, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to kick it into high gear because we've got to cover the same amount of ground in just about half the time. But think about when we move out from this nation, we need to view the scenes from these people that were really called rebels, because there's this question that's going to be asked, verse 14. And Nebuchadnezzar specifically is going to ask them and speak to them. He's going to say, is it true? That's right, everyone. I've read multiple different views about that, and let me get back with you on that, okay? I haven't quite found one that hits it the way I think is right, nor do I have an exact statement I want to say out loud right now, if that makes any sense. But here's what I know. These specific princes and governors, I would suggest to you that he wasn't there because he wasn't in that class set of these people that the king brought out. If you go back to verse 3, that wouldn't have been the group that Daniel was now in. I missed everything you said. Yes. It didn't last long, and that's why I wanted to start at chapter 2. This God that could reveal dreams, he's a revealer of secrets. We forgot about him when we enter into chapter 3. Because who's the God of chapter 3? Nebuchadnezzar is, isn't it? This great golden image that he has set up, and he's expecting people to bow down. And who's offended if they don't? It's Nebuchadnezzar. So the view from these individuals is they stand before Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, is it true? Did you not serve my gods? Do you not serve me? Do you not worship the golden image that I have set up? The phrase Nebuchadnezzar has set up, or I have set up, is used over and over in the first 14 verses. A lot of pride, a lot of lack of humility from Nebuchadnezzar. So they're given this great question, and they answer it as you follow out because it becomes an opportunity. The king says, you know what? You must have not heard it. We'll do it again. So after all this plays out, for 3 men, he does it all again. But that didn't work, did it? Is it going to be right for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to now bow down to this golden image? Is it ever right to do the wrong thing? What if you're pressured? You think Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego didn't feel pressure? What was coming to them? A great fiery, let's say it the way it is instead of the word furnace, it's a great fiery death. What would we do? Now, we're not standing before Nebuchadnezzar. We're not standing before a great golden image where everybody else is bowed down except 3 of us. What would you do? You really can't answer that. That's an unfair question, isn't it? So they are given the opportunity. They're given the opportunity to do what's right. And they have to give an answer to the king, and they do that in verses 16 through verse 18. They answer and tell the king that they're very careful. I love how they start this. We're very careful to answer you in this matter. Well, why did they need to be careful? Well, where was this going? Well, to their untimely death, isn't it? We're careful we're not going to mess this up. We're not trying to disrespect you in this matter. But he says, if it be so that our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, then he will deliver us out of thy hand. What did they stand up and tell him? We're not doing it. That's right. That's right. Let me ask you a question that I believe is fair tonight. But do the right things sometimes upset people? They do, don't they? All right, we're going to read in just a minute about how upset Nebuchadnezzar is. But do the right things ever upset people? Of course they do. Does that mean Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego bow down? I mean, the easy way out is to do what? Just bow down. It's not that big of a deal. Yeah, everybody else is doing it. Remember how we started the conversation? What was popular? There are a lot of things that are popular today, aren't there? Can you think of anything that's popular today that is sinful? Anybody got one? Dancing, okay. Drinking. Fornication, adultery. Lying. Are those things popular? Are those things popular? Oh, yeah, they are. What happens when you don't do them? I know you're not standing before a golden image tonight, and I know that in your regular everyday lives, we're not standing before a golden image where everyone's expecting us to do this, but we are standing in a world where we are expected to live like the world. There's not a lot of difference in that. You just take away the fiery furnace. But by the way, in this life, is there a fiery furnace? Eternally? Just think about it for just a minute. There's a lot of correlation between Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Christians. That's right. The world, Nebuchadnezzar, had them convinced that they would not go to a fiery furnace if they would just bow down and worship him. Same ploy that the devil used on Jesus, isn't it? You just bow down and worship me. And how many times do we as Christians, we worship our world rather than our Creator? They did. That's right.
And I think modern-day Christians in foreign countries, such as China, Russia,
Yes.
and the Islamic countries, face the same thing.
You're right. You're right. We just really don't know how good we've got it. We live in a land of freedom. We live in a land of opportunity. We have not been taken, listen to this, captive from our land and made eunuchs to serve Babylon. That was Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were made eunuchs to serve in Babylon. They did this to curb the physical temptations of this world, which, by the way, if they knew that in their government, isn't that interesting? They knew they had to curb the physical temptations of their servants. That's interesting to me. But yet we don't recognize this very often. But now, by a show of hands, have you ever been tempted? Well, there's a few of you. There we go. Nobody wanted to say yes. I know. Nobody wanted to participate but that proves a point to us, doesn't it? It may not have been in front of that golden image. It may be in front of everybody else. For these three, they were in front of everyone. They had to face everyone. They had to face everything that was going on. And they faced, as we move forward in verse 19, the hatred of Nebuchadnezzar. Then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and his form, his visage was changed. I imagine, as you look at him in verse 14, surely this is not true. I'll give you another chance. Down to verse 19, much different Nebuchadnezzar. Do we ever fear our world? You ever feared this world? I'm not talking about what's going on right now. I'm talking about the other people in this world. Do we ever fear this world? The answer is from time to time we may fear this world. But I highly doubt many of us have stood before someone who was about to put us to death. And that's the hatred that's seen from the heart of Nebuchadnezzar. His visage was changed. He was full of fury. And it gave a result. You look at verses 20 through 22 inside of the chapter. They were commanded, verse 20, or it was commanded they would be bound. In verse 21, these men were bound in their coats. Everything was taken from them. And they were cast in the middle of the fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment, verse 22, was urgent, the furnace was exceedingly hot, and the fire slew those men that took them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Even the men that delivered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to this flame, they didn't survive. So don't read past verse 22 for just a minute. Just close your eyes to everything that you know. Should Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have survived? Take it on the physical. The men that didn't even enter the flames, but yet threw them in the flames, what happened to them? Verse 22. They perished. So what are the odds of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego surviving? Just in the physical. 0. 0. Now, who did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, this is who we're going to follow? This is the one that can save us. In fact, you go back up to verses 16 through 18. It was the God of heaven, wasn't it? It was the God of heaven. and this hatred that resulted in this great fire. And you see them, they fell down, verse 23, down into this flame. They were in the midst and they were bound. Boy, it's one thing to not be bound. It's another thing to be bound and helpless. That takes our percentage of 0 and almost makes it a negative, doesn't it? I know numbers don't work like that, but you imagine the point. They were in the midst of this, and they should not have survived. Verses 24 and 25 are probably very important to this chapter, because in the midst of this, Nebuchadnezzar, he was astonished, because they threw how many people in the flames? And how many did they see? 4. What are the odds of 3 human beings becoming 4? Strange question, huh? What are the odds of 3 human beings becoming 4? Do we not cast these men bound in the midst of the fire? Verse 25, they answered and said to the king, "True, O king." And he answered and said, "Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th was like the Son of God." That's a good number. I mean, just think about it. What are the odds? Very low, huh? All of this is the view of men who were considered to be rebels. They didn't follow the law. They didn't follow the king. They didn't follow the ways of the world. They rebelled against everybody else. And yet God is there for them. Now, here's something I want to say, and you take it in the way it's being said, not in the way that you're probably going to think about it. But is God saving you out of the fiery furnace today? Does God work like that today? You're right. And I think we're saying the same things. Is God going to pluck you out of the fire in this physical life? Or is God going to give you the knowledge to survive this life and to make it into eternity? There's the difference between Daniel chapter 3 and today. Now, they had the knowledge to follow after God, and they did so, but God intervened in life so many times in the Old Testament. We don't see that today, do we? The only way we would know that God was intervening is how? How do we know that God intervened in the lives of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? How do we know? Because, there you go. There's the answer. The only way we know that God intervened in the lives of men is through whose word? Through His. God has given us a brain. God has given us the ability to understand. And God has given us the ability to do what's right. The New Testament would say it this way: we ought to obey God rather than men. Same thing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were doing, and God intervened. And thus I want you to see something, and it's the key of what we're trying to get to tonight. It's the heart of a servant. That's what I want us to see from Daniel chapter 3. I want us to think less about the furnace. I want us to think less about this golden image that Nebuchadnezzar set up. I want you to think less about the people who said they're not doing it. And I want you to focus on the heart of servanthood that takes place here in this chapter, beginning in verse 26 and rolling down to verse 29. These are the last few verses that are in the chapter, because when you open this up, you have now, when you view the heart of a servant, you have some words that come from the king. This is verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of, now listen to this, the Most High who? The Most High God, come forth of the midst of the fire. Now, we don't know how much time took place between the time that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego entered the flames and the time that Nebuchadnezzar goes and speaks to them. But here's what I do know, and you know this as well, just a general rule of thumb. It had to be some span of time. Because what happened to the men that threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire? They were consumed. They died. The heat overtook them. And now Nebuchadnezzar goes where? Verse 26. To the mouth of the entrance of the flames. He doesn't die. I don't know how long it took for it to cool down. I don't know if that's something that God did or not. But here's what I know. Nebuchadnezzar goes and says, come out. The king is, if you'll go back in the previous verses, he was astonished at what he saw. And all of a sudden from the king, the servants of the Most High God come out. May that be what people see when they see us. They are the servants of God. The heart of a servant, the view of a servant comes in the form that people see God and not us. You're the servants of the Most High God. You come out. And thus you see the idea from their peers, verse 27. The princes, the governors, the captains, the king counselors, pause for just a minute, all the people who said they didn't bow down to you. They were gathered together. They saw these men upon whom bodies had not, or who the fire had no power, nor was a hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. They were astonished. Why were they astonished? Well, the same reason we've always been captivated by this account. They shouldn't have made it. They should have not made it. But why did they make it? Why did they make it? Well, in the midst of the great flames, in the midst of this great persecution, one stood with them. He was likened unto the Son of God. So you see their peers. And you also see a phrase that's said about God. This is verse 28. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him and have changed the king's word and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Now this is impressive because how did the world that we're looking at in Daniel chapter 3 view gods? How do they view gods? Well, Babylon thought that they had taken over the people of God. Therefore, they thought they had destroyed or overpowered who? God. And what is Nebuchadnezzar learning here? We've done nothing of the sort. Because whose God saved Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? It was not the gods of Babylon. It was not the gods of which Babylon has overtaken. It was not any other little g god, but yet it was the big G God of the Old Testament. And thus you see this phrase, and really it's from God because it is the testament of who God is. God will overshadow every problem of this life and overshadow everything that says it's a God. Overshadowed Nebuchadnezzar here. He even had to say, who has changed my words? Now, the word of the king didn't change. That was arrogance, really, is what it was. Whether he was right or wrong, those words didn't change. But they did this time. That's right. And that's what he is learning here. The God of which they cannot worship was Nebuchadnezzar. The God of which they could not serve in this way was Nebuchadnezzar, because they could only serve their God. Now, just for a minute, pause here in verse 28. Only two other verses really to see inside of this particular section. Verses 29 and verse 30. What would it look like if all the kingdoms of the world could see God as Nebuchadnezzar saw him? What would it take for that to happen? What would it take? That's a strange question, I know. But just think about it in the simple premise of Daniel chapter 3. How did Nebuchadnezzar see God? It was because 3 people stood with God. How will our president see God? How will the other leaders of other nations see God? Because that's what we're talking about in Daniel chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar was the leader of the known world. And how did he see God? Well, in Daniel chapter 1, he saw God's people which took to their principles. We don't want to defile ourselves. In Daniel chapter 2, he saw God because God's people and because of God's power stood above all the rest. In Daniel chapter 3, he saw God because God's people would not give up on God. So how are our leaders of our known world going to see God? Well, may I suggest to you, it's when people just like you and me stand with God. That's what happened in Daniel chapter 3. That's what took place. Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because he had the power to do so. And thus you see this phrase from the king. This is in verse 29. Therefore I make a decree. Remember, this is how it all started. That every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut into pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Could you imagine a political leader today saying there is only one God? Well, that's what Nebuchadnezzar has now said. There is no other God that could do what the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego has done. A little graphic too, by the way, verse 29. If anyone speaks amiss of this God, what's going to happen to them? Well, they're going to be cut into pieces, a little graphic, and their homes are going to be made wastelands. By the way, Nebuchadnezzar, who was introduced to God, loved God, beginning of chapter 3, forgot about God, and now at the end of chapter 3 is remembering God. He recognizes that he and all others should respect God. What would it look like if we respected God as Nebuchadnezzar talked about God here in verse 29? It'd be different, wouldn't it? Then finally, verse 30. I know the screen's going to say verse 29, but this is verse 30. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. That's right. He put them on the track of success. Why did that happen? Why did that happen? I know sometimes good people never see some of the good things in this life. I know sometimes bad people never see the good in this life. I know sometimes bad people succeed in this life. But for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego specifically, why did they succeed? Why did they succeed? Their faith. And listen, God's not promising for you and I the prosperity gospel. You give God so much money, He'll give you so much money. You give God so much time, He'll give you so much time. Nor did He promise that to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But if you follow after Scripture, will you prosper in this life? Will you be, verse 30, promoted in this life? Well, you may not be by the world's standards, but you will be by God's standards, because you end the chapter with a group of people who are the image of being a servant. Being a servant does not mean getting the pat on the back. Being a servant, according to Daniel chapter 3, means simply following God. Now, I want to ask it a different way. If we are for God, who will get in our way? Think about that for just a minute. Inside of the book of Daniel, as we've looked at Daniel chapter 3, as we think about our evening coming to a close tonight, I want you to recognize that in Daniel chapter 3, there was the world and there was God's people. Now, the world said, if you'll just bow down, everything will be all right. Isn't that what we read? What did God say about that? What did God in the long ago tell His people? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. They couldn't bow down, and therefore they had to face that fiery furnace. But in a very similar way, you and I face an eternal fiery furnace. I know this is very unusual for us on a Wednesday evening to end a class thinking about the invitation, but that's what I want us to do tonight. You and I will face eternity in one of two places. Either we will be with Jesus or we will not. Either we will influence others to be with Jesus or we will not. The decision is ours. No, God's not going to physically pull you out of the fire. But just like there was the one who was in the image of the Son of God, God has made a sacrifice for us. We don't have to face an eternal flame that will destroy, that will cause suffering and weeping and gnashing of teeth, as the New Testament describes. But we do need to recognize that Jesus has come to take our place. Remember the view of a servant? That's a servant. He didn't come to get a pat on the back, did he? He came to take our place. And thus, because of that, we can have things like baptistries. The only reason we have a baptistry is because of Jesus. It's not because we think having 500 gallons of hot water is just neat. It's because there's a purpose behind being immersed into water to come into contact with the blood of Christ. Maybe you need that tonight. Maybe you just succumb to the pressures of this world. That's easy to do, isn't it? It is. The good thing about it is that when we become Christians, God is always on our side. Jesus is described as our advocate, as the one that pleads our case. He's the one that took our place. And we can still, through prayer, come back to the Father and be forgiven. Tell you what, the system of Christianity is set up so that it's really hard to fail, isn't it? Because all the work, all the really hard work has been done. Now we just have to decide when the music plays whether we're going to bow down or not. That's chapter 3. But really, isn't that our lives? We make that decision every day. Am I going to worship the world or am I going to worship God? We'll have to be deciding that. Caleb has picked out a song for us to sing as our invitation song. If you need to become a Christian tonight, you can. Maybe you need to make your life right with the Lord. You let that be known as together we stand and sing.